What was lost before humanity learned how to remember itself? It is a quiet question, the kind that does not knock at the door of history, but waits in the dark just beyond the candlelight, where written memory fades and the earth begins to keep its own counsel. Long before kings were named, before temples rose from dust, before grief was carved into stone, there were other beings moving through ancient forests and broken grasslands under skies no human language had yet described. They left behind no chronicles, no prayers, no map of how one form of life leaned slowly toward another. They left fragments, a curve of jaw, a worn tooth, a hip bone lifted from clay after millions of years of burial. The beginning of the human story does not arrive like a trumpet. It arrives like a missing page, and perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling. Humanity has built entire civilizations around the comfort of origin stories. Empires have claimed divine descent, religions have offered sacred beginnings, nations have wrapped themselves in myths of first fathers and chosen lands. But the deeper one travels into the history of the body itself, the more unstable the ground becomes. The lineage leading toward the human face does not appear as a clean road cut through time. It appears more like a landscape after a flood, scattered with remnants, interrupted by erosion, altered by pressure, and only partly visible through the shifting mist of interpretation. What survives is precious, but what vanished may have been far greater. The earth, for all its apparent generosity, is not a faithful archivist. It destroys as much as it preserves. Flesh disappears almost immediately. Bone survives only when chance allows it. A skeleton must be buried quickly enough, deeply enough, and in the right chemical company, spared the teeth of scavengers, the violence of rivers, the cracking of sun, the slow grinding indifference of geology. Even then, millions of years may pass before another accident brings it back into the light. A ravine opens, a storm peels away sediment, a researcher notices an unusual shape in stone. Entire worlds can hinge on such small mercies. One can spend a lifetime studying human origins and still feel that the record is less a library than a ruin. That ruin has its own strange beauty. In the red soils of East Africa, in ancient lake beds and fault valleys, in layers of volcanic ash and compressed sediment, there are traces of lives so old they seem almost beyond imagination, and yet they belong to a story that would one day lead, however unevenly, toward hands that paint caves, minds that bury the dead, cities that worship the heavens, and voices that now lie awake at night wondering who first began to stand, to look outward, to remember. The mystery is not only how humanity emerged, it is also why the evidence appears so broken, so scattered, so unwilling to yield a simple answer. Was the path itself tangled, full of experiments and lost branches? Or has time erased the greater part of what once existed, leaving modern people to mistake a handful of survivors for the whole design? There is a certain arrogance in the way official history is often told, not always in bad faith, but with a tidy confidence that the past rarely deserves. A chart is drawn. A branching tree is printed in a textbook. A sequence of species is arranged as though one form stepped politely aside for the next, each scala rung on a ladder leading upward to the present. It is orderly, it is teachable, it is comforting. But the soil does not behave like a classroom diagram. The deeper the fossil record is examined, the more it resists the fantasy of straight lines. There were side branches, there were overlapping lives, there were bodies that carried features no longer found together, creatures neither fully familiar nor wholly alien. There were probably more of them than the public imagination has room for. Some endured, most vanished. Their disappearance was not ceremonial. It was silent. And silence is its own kind of force in this story. Not only the silence of creatures too early for language, but the silence created later by institutions that prefer stable narratives over unresolved questions. Science, at its best, is not an empire of certainty. It is a disciplined form of doubt. Yet once scientific ideas pass into popular memory, they often harden. Uncertainties become neat conclusions. Debates are flattened into captions. What was once presented as a cautious interpretation begins to sound like doctrine. This does not require a hidden cabal or a dramatic conspiracy behind locked doors. Human systems manage simplification all by themselves. Museums must label, schools must summarize, documentaries must move forward, and so the ancient confusion of bones and landscapes is translated into something smoother than it truly is. But the unease returns whenever a new fossil appears, a piece of skull from a place where no one expected it, a pelvis that suggests one mode of walking and a foot that suggests another, teeth that seem too early or too late or too strange to fit the established order. Each find has the power to disturb the architecture of certainty. The story of human evolution, despite how often it is presented as settled, has been revised again and again by these interruptions from the ground. That alone should inspire humility. The species now calling itself wise may know more than it once did, but it still reconstructs its beginnings from remnants so incomplete that every new discovery can rearrange the atmosphere of the past. And beneath that scientific tension, there is something older, almost philosophical. Why does the human mind hunger so deeply for beginnings? Why should a partial skeleton in Ethiopia, or a few weathered bones from an older ape-like relative, exert such power over the imagination? Perhaps because origin is never only about the past. It is about legitimacy, identity, and destiny. To ask where humanity came from is also to ask what kind of creature it is, whether it rose through accident or design, whether consciousness emerged gradually or broke into the world like a flame, whether civilization is a summit or merely a brief clearing in a much longer wilderness. The body remembers things the written record never knew. The pelvis, the spine, the hand, the angle of a knee. These are not just anatomical facts. They are clues in a forgotten inheritance. Somewhere far ahead in this long journey waits Lucy, the small and astonishing skeleton who would one day become one of the most famous ancestral figures ever lifted from the earth. But it would be too easy to begin with her as though she were the first clear light. Lucy is not the beginning. She's a lantern glimpsed much later, already deep inside a corridor whose entrance is still half collapsed. Before her came other beings, older and stranger, closer to the world of ancient apes, shaped by climates that changed slowly and then all at once, by forests that thinned, by distances that widened, by selective pressures no eye ever witnessed. To approach Lucy honestly, one must first enter that older darkness. So the story opens not with triumph, but with absence. Not with humanity fully formed, but with a wound in memory. The deeper past is not empty, it is obscured. It has been buried by time, ground by weather, simplified by institutions, and repeatedly mistaken for something more complete than it is. Yet in the gaps themselves there is meaning. Every fracture in the record reminds the listener that the human story was never guaranteed. It survived through contingency, through adaptation, through countless extinguished possibilities. And if so much of the beginning is missing, then perhaps the most unsettling thought is not that the truth has been hidden, but that it was always fragile. Tonight that fragility lingers like dust in an excavation trench, glowing briefly in late light before settling back into the earth. Somewhere beneath layers of stone and silence lie the bones of forms no one has yet named, leaves that stood near the threshold and then disappeared without witness. The modern world speaks endlessly of progress, but its own beginning still waits in fragments, as if history itself were reluctant to reveal how uncertain the first steps really were. And if the path from ancient ape to early human was not a straight ascent but a field of vanished attempts, then one question remains, quiet and unclosed. When the earth finally gives up another bone, will it confirm what has been told for generations? Or will it expose how little of the beginning was ever truly understood? If the first wound in this story is silence, the second is abundance. That may seem like a contradiction, but the ancient world often leaves behind its deepest truths in paradox. The modern imagination looks at the living world and sees only a few great apes remaining: chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and humans, isolated now in their separate corners of the earth, as though this small assembly were all that ever existed. Yet the deeper past suggests something far stranger. There was once a time when ape life was richer, more varied, more experimental than the present world allows itself to remember. The forests of the Miocene did not hold a single road toward humanity. They held a crowded and fading chorus. To picture that vanished age is to enter a world almost offensively indifferent to later human importance. No cities waited in seed form. No destiny announced itself from the branches. There were no chosen ancestors walking beneath a spotlight, no singular creature marked out by nature as the inevitable heir to consciousness. There were apes, many kinds of them, living through millions of years in landscapes that shifted with a patience too large for any single lifetime to notice. Some climbed with confidence through dense canopies. Some fed on fruit in humid forests. Some adapted to changing habitats as climates cooled and woodlands opened into mixed mosaics of trees and grass. The ancient ape world was not preparing a throne for humanity. It was improvising survival. That may be one of the first illusions this story must let go. Human beings are inclined to imagine the past as if it were always moving toward them. The mind likes to rearrange old bones into prophecy. But the Miocene, stretching from about 23 million to just over 5 million years ago, was not a prologue written for human benefit. It was an era of proliferation and disappearance, of branching lives trying different answers to the same immense question. How does a primate endure on a restless planet? Some of those answers led nowhere, at least not by the standards of later human self-interest. But nowhere is a cruel word for a form of life that once breathed, fed, mated, protected its young, and knew the world in ways no human being ever will. The deeper researchers have looked into that age, the more unsettling the picture has become. The apes of the Miocene were not merely rough drafts of creatures living today. Many appear to have been distinct experiments, anatomically varied, ecologically adapted and not easily arranged on a ladder toward any final form. Some fossils hint at bodies specialized for suspension beneath branches. Others suggest more complex mixtures of climbing, grasping, and terrestrial movement. Teeth and jaws reveal diets shaped by local environments that no longer exist in the same way. Limbs speak in partial sentences. Vertebrae whisper of posture. But no single fossil explains the whole. Each one arrives as if torn from a much larger manuscript, and that manuscript has been burned in pieces by time. This is the part that often goes unspoken when human origins are summarized too cleanly. The ancient ape world was not merely older than written memory, it was more complete than the surviving evidence. What is known now comes from rare conditions of preservation and rarer conditions of discovery. Vast populations must have lived and died without leaving a trace that lasted. Entire lineages may have flourished for ages and vanished into geological oblivion. Valleys collapsed, forests transformed, sediments eroded, bones dissolved. The earth did not preserve the full parliament of its creatures, it preserved a few delegates, and from them the living attempt to reconstruct the whole debate. This is where a quieter kind of mystery begins to unfold. If the record is so incomplete, how much of the story commonly told about human emergence is shaped not only by what survived, but by what failed to survive? That is not a rejection of science. It is in a sense an extension of it. Scientific reconstruction is always limited by evidence, and evidence is always limited by preservation. The danger lies not in acknowledging uncertainty, but in forgetting that uncertainty exists. A vanished branch leaves no argument for itself. A species with no recoverable skeleton cannot disturb the charts in textbooks. The dead do not protest omission, they simply remain absent, while the few bones that endure are asked to bear the weight of an entire vanished world. It is easy to imagine this abundance as comforting, even lush, a green age of forests filled with motion and noise, and perhaps in moments it was. But there is another way to see it, one that carries a faint chill beneath the leaves. An abundant world is also a world of competition, pressure, instability, and endings. Climates did not remain fixed. Tectonic processes altered topography. Rainfall patterns shifted over long spans. Forest belts expanded and withdrew. Food sources changed. The bodies of primates, like all bodies, were never outside these forces. They were written by them. The ape world of the Miocene was not a peaceful waiting room before humanity arrived. It was a theatre of adaptation in which many forms succeeded for a time and then disappeared, not because they failed in any moral sense, but because the world itself refused permanence. That refusal matters. It suggests that the road toward later hominins may have emerged not from superiority in any grand triumphant sense, but from contingency, an accumulation of small survivals under changing conditions. A branch holds, a season softens, a habitat corridor remains open long enough for one population to endure, another closes, another dries, another scatters a lineage beyond recovery. The future of primates may have been shaped less by destiny than by interruptions. If so, then the human story begins not as a march, but as an escape through narrowing gates. There is also a psychological discomfort in realizing that humanity did not rise from a lonely pair of ancestors standing apart from the natural world, but from an ancient crowd. Crowds complicate identity. They deny uniqueness. They remind the listener that the human body was assembled within a broader primate experiment, sharing deep kinship with creatures that were neither human nor merely primitive in any simple sense. Some ancient apes may have been closer to the roots of the later human line. Others may have stood nearer the ancestry of living great apes. Many almost certainly occupied positions that are now impossible to define with confidence. But all of them belong to a world in which the categories of later thought had not yet hardened. The old forests kept no hierarchy that resembled the one humans would later invent. There was no sacred divide between the creatures that mattered and the creatures that did not. That divide came later, after language, after myth, after empire, after systems of knowledge began separating human life from animal life and treating consciousness as though it had appeared all at once, like a gate flung open. Yet the fossil whispers tell another kind of story. They suggest continuity so deep that the modern mind sometimes recoils from them. Hands were already grasping, eyes were already judging distance through leaves and shadow. Social bonds, fear, nourishment, competition, maternal care, territorial awareness, these did not begin with humanity. They were inherited through bodies that lived and died long before the first toolmaker ever named the world. And somewhere within that crowded, vanishing ape age, the conditions for a more radical divergence were gathering. Not clearly, not theatrically, not in a way any witness could have recognized, but perhaps in subtle changes of habitat, movement, foraging, and anatomy. The first faint separation was beginning between the line that would lead toward humans and the line that would lead toward the closest living apes. The listener cannot see that split yet. It remains ahead, hidden in the half-light of fragmentary evidence. For now, only the pressure of numbers can be felt. Many apes, many branches, many extinctions, and a past far less tidy than later memory prefers. The forest of origins, then, was never a single tree. It was a thicket, dense with forms now mostly erased, and its silence is made more haunting by the suspicion that what has been lost was not marginal, but immense. If the ancient ape world was fuller than the present can imagine, then the question grows heavier as the night deepens. When humanity searches for its beginning, is it truly uncovering the source of itself, or only walking through the ruins of a far larger family it no longer knows how to mourn? At some point in the deep past, a separation occurred so quietly that no living thing could have understood its significance. No sky changed colour. No mountains split. No voice announced that one lineage was turning toward what would one day be called human, while another continued toward the beings modern science would know as chimpanzees and bonobos. And yet that division, however gradual, however blurred, may be one of the most consequential events in the entire history of life on this planet. It is the hidden fracture beneath every later city, scripture, empire, machine, and grave. The difficulty is that it was never recorded. It had to be inferred from echoes. That alone should inspire a certain humility. The modern world speaks often of origins as though they were places that could be pointed to on a map, dates that could be circled in ink, thresholds that could be crossed in a single step. But biological divergence does not honour the impatience of later minds. Species do not always separate in one dramatic instant. Populations drift, landscapes shift, rivers become barriers, forests contract and reopen. Groups that once exchanged genes begin to do so less often, then rarely, then perhaps not at all. Over countless generations, anatomy, behaviour and ecological pressures alter the rhythm of life itself. What later appears as a line on a diagram may once have been a long uncertainty lived by creatures who had no idea they stood inside a turning point. Even now, when genetics has given researchers a new language for measuring relatedness, the precise timing of that split remains an estimate, not a witnessed fact. The usual range, often placed somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago, offers a broad frame. But no one can point to a single birth and say, "Here began the human path." The listener is left with a strange realization. One of the most important transitions in human history is not a scene that can be reconstructed with confidence, but a zone of shadow, a stretch of time in which kinship slowly hardened into separation. Humanity did not step suddenly out of the ape world. It drifted from within it, so gradually that the break itself may have been invisible from the inside. There is something haunting in that thought. Modern humans spend much of life protecting the illusion of clear identity. They name categories, defend borders, distinguish self from other with almost ritual intensity. Yet the deeper one looks into human origins, the more unstable those boundaries become. The closest living relatives of the human species are not distant curiosities in some forgotten branch of life. They are chimpanzees and bonobos, creatures whose bodies, emotions, social conflicts, maternal attachments, and flashes of recognition have long unsettled those who prefer a more absolute divide. The split did not create a pure distance. It left behind a disturbing nearness. Perhaps that nearness is one reason origin stories have so often been wrapped in myth, symbol, or resistance. To accept that the human lineage emerged from within an ape ancestry is not merely to learn a scientific fact, it is to surrender a certain comfort. It means that the human hand, which would later paint caves, raise monuments, write laws, and bless or condemn in the name of unseen powers, carries within it an older inheritance shared with beings that never built temples and never claimed dominion over the earth. It means that beneath language and philosophy, the body still bears the architecture of a much older world. The shoulder, the grasping hand, the binocular gaze, the social mind tuned to alliances and threat. These are not ornaments of humanity. They are deep continuities, and yet continuity is not sameness. Somewhere in that dim interval, the lineage that would become human began accumulating its own peculiar departures, not all at once, and not in a neat ascending order. The old fantasy that the brain led the way, dragging the body upward into civilization, has long been weakened by fossil evidence suggesting that upright walking emerged long before large brains. The body may have begun changing direction, while the mind, in any recognizable human sense, still lay unimaginably far ahead. This is important, because it removes the split from the realm of heroic revelation. The early difference may not have been noble, grand, or even visible in the face. It may have begun in subtler negotiations between anatomy and landscape. That possibility deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Why did one branch begin leaning toward more habitual bipedalism? Why did the environments inhabited by these ancestral populations place such pressures on movement, foraging, or social structure? Was the separation driven by climate, by habitat fragmentation, by chance dispersal, by competition, or by combinations too complex to reduce to a single cause? Research offers possibilities, patterns, models, and increasingly sophisticated comparisons, but it does not offer the satisfaction of an eyewitness account. The origin of the human line remains not a solved scene, but a reconstruction assembled from genetics, anatomy, sediment, and argument. Argument has always lived close to the centre of this field. That is not a weakness. It is a sign that the subject remains alive. New fossils appear in one region and challenge assumptions formed elsewhere. A skull suggests one phylogenetic position. A femur suggests another. Molecular clocks estimate divergence windows, but their precision depends on calibration and interpretation. Scientists debate not because the enterprise is broken, but because the evidence is difficult and the stakes are enormous. To place a fossil near the last common ancestry of humans and chimpanzees is to stand near the root of the human story itself. Caution becomes a form of intellectual honesty. But outside those debates, the public often receives a calmer version, stripped of hesitation, as though the origin of the human line were a cleanly marked doorway instead of a threshold blurred by deep time. There is another kind of loss hidden here as well. The split between lineages is often described only in terms of what led to humans, as though the other branch existed merely as contrast. But that is a distortion born of human vanity. The lineage leading toward chimpanzees and bonobos was not a static remainder, frozen in time while humans advanced. It was changing too, adapting in its own ways, living through its own evolutionary history. Modern chimpanzees are not living fossils standing in for the past. They are contemporary beings, shaped by millions of years of evolution after the split, just as humans were. The common ancestor belongs fully to neither present form. It has disappeared, leaving descendants that each carry only part of what once was. This vanished ancestor may be one of the most powerful ghosts in all of prehistory. It cannot be directly observed. It is reconstructed through the comparison of the living species and the interpretation of older fossils that cluster around the right ages and traits. It stands behind the narrative like a figure half seen through fog, important precisely because it refuses to become clear. The mind wants to know what it looked like, how it moved, whether it lived mainly in trees, how social it was, what sounds it made into humid air at dusk. But the earth, so generous with questions, offers very few full answers. It gives a tooth, a fragment, an angle of bone, and then waits while generations of researchers argue beneath fluorescent lights over what the silence means. Still, there is something almost tender in the fact that the human story begins not with domination, but with kinship. Before the first blade of stone, before the first controlled fire, before anything that would later be called civilization, there was shared ancestry. There was a world in which the future human line had not yet become fully distinct from the line that would lead to chimpanzees and bonobos. To look backward far enough is to find not superiority, but relation. The listener may feel in that realization a quiet unease. Much of human history has been built on separating, ranking, and excluding. But the body remembers a deeper lesson. That identity emerged from entanglement. And perhaps that is why this ancient split still feels unfinished in the imagination. It is not merely a scientific problem of dating divergence. It is a mirror held to the human condition. If the boundary between human and other was once so gradual that no creature living through it could have named it, then how secure are the categories upon which later civilizations built their certainty? The old fracture remains hidden beneath everything that followed, a seam in deep time no hand can touch directly. Somewhere in that long unobserved drifting apart, the future took shape without permission, without witness, without myth to soften it, and as the lineage that would become human moved further into its separate path, one unsettling thought lingers in the dark. If the first great division in human history was so subtle that it could only be recognized millions of years later, what else may have changed in silence before anyone knew the world had already become something new? A skull emerged from the desert, and with it came a question so old that it seemed to bend the air around it. Not a complete answer, not a triumphant revelation, but a disturbance. In northern Chad, far from the narrower corridors where many earlier stories of human origins had preferred to linger, fossil remains attributed to Sahelanthropus chadensis entered the modern imagination and unsettled the map. Dated to roughly 7 to 6 million years ago, this being stood close enough to the shadowed interval after the human chimpanzee split to feel less like a specimen than a threshold, and thresholds are unsettling things. They do not let the mind rest on one side or the other, they force it to hesitate. The skull itself became famous under the name Tumai, and like many famous objects in the history of origins, it was burdened almost immediately with more meaning than any fossil should be expected to carry. The remains were announced in 2002, after discovery in the Jurab Desert region of Chad, and the find drew immediate attention not only because of its antiquity, but because of its geography. For a long time, public narratives had leaned heavily toward East Africa as the unquestioned centre of the early hominin discovery. Chad, in West Central Africa, widened the frame. It implied that the ancient landscape of human origins may have been broader, less obedient to neat regional assumptions than simplified accounts had suggested. Even before the arguments over anatomy fully unfolded, the fossil had already done something quietly radical. It changed where the beginning could be imagined. Yet the unease surrounding Sahelanthropus was never only about place, it was about form. The cranium and associated material seemed to combine ape-like and more human-like traits in a way that made certainty difficult. The brain size was small, closer to that of living chimpanzees than modern humans, which was no surprise for such an ancient fossil. But other features drew intense attention, especially aspects of the face and teeth. The face appeared relatively short and somewhat flatter than expected in a typical ape, and the canines were reduced compared with those of many non-human apes. These details did not prove that the fossil belonged securely within the human lineage, but they kept the possibility alive with stubborn force. It looked ancient, certainly, but it also looked as if ancientness itself were beginning to rearrange. And then there was the question that haunts nearly every fossil close to the root of the human line. Did it walk upright? That question has always carried more weight than it seems to deserve. Bipedalism is often treated as a signature, almost a passcode into the hominin story. Not because walking on two legs made a creature noble, but because it marks such a profound departure in posture, locomotion, anatomy, and the relationship between body and landscape. For years, the possibility of upright posture in Sahelanthropus rested heavily on cranial interpretation, especially the position of the foramen magnum, the opening through which the spinal cord passes. Some researchers argued that its placement suggested a head balanced on a more upright body. Others warned that distortion of the fossil complicated any confident claim. It was an argument carried out not in sweeping declarations, but in millimeters. In the deep past, a few degrees of angle can become a philosophical storm. Later work intensified the tension rather than dissolving it. In 2022, a Nature paper presented postcranial evidence from Chad and argued that the available remains supported bipedal locomotion in Sahelanthropus, pushing the roots of upright walking deep into the late Miocene. Yet the debate did not end there. Other researchers continued to question whether the evidence was sufficient to support habitual bipedalism beyond serious doubt. This lingering disagreement is not an embarrassment to the field. It is the field speaking honestly in its natural voice. The oldest chapters of human evolution do not yield themselves cleanly. They resist finality, and perhaps they should. A fossil so near the origin of the human line ought to trouble certainty. There is something almost symbolic in the fact that one of the earliest possible hominins is known through a distorted skull. The fossil itself carries the wound of time. Compressed, altered, difficult to reconstruct with complete confidence, it reminds the modern observer that the evidence is never received in innocence. Bones do not arrive untouched. They come through pressure, burial, chemical change, and the interpretive frameworks of those who study them. By the time a fossil enters a museum, an article, or a documentary, it has already passed through many layers of transformation. Even the act of calling it the earliest hominin is provisional, a claim balanced on available evidence rather than eternal certainty. Smithsonian's own framing reflects this caution, describing Sahelanthropus chadensis as one of the oldest known species in the human family tree, rather than as a final, unchallenged answer. And that caution matters, because the temptation to simplify is always close at hand. The public prefers clean beginnings. It wants the first upright figure, the first ancestor, the first unmistakable step away from ape-like life. But the fossil record keeps whispering a different truth. Origins do not arrive clean. They blur. They overlap. They appear in fragments, often in landscapes that later generations did not expect to matter so much. Sahelanthropus may stand within the human lineage, very near its root, or it may occupy a position just outside the line modern people most want to trace. Either way, its importance remains. It exposes the instability of the border itself. It shows that the threshold between ape ancestry and human ancestry was not a bright gate, but a dim and contested passage. There is also a quiet loneliness in fossils like this. They are asked to represent whole populations, entire ways of moving, feeding, competing, mating, and enduring, yet what survives is so slight. A skull, a few jaw fragments, teeth, possibly associated limb bones. The living creature behind them is gone beyond recovery, along with its voice, its smell, its rhythms of waking and rest, its experience of heat and shade. Modern science can infer habitat diversity for Sahelanthropus, including forests and grasslands, and it can compare anatomy to other primates and early hominins. But the individual life is lost. What remains is a narrow beam cast through the darkness, enough to reveal shape, never enough to restore presence fully. So this part of the story does not resolve the great fracture opened in the previous chapter, it sharpens it. If the human line was separating from that of chimpanzees and bonobos in a long uncertain dusk, then Sahelanthropus stands somewhere inside that dusk, perhaps already leaning toward the human path, perhaps still too ambiguous to claim with confidence. It is ancient enough to feel almost prehistorical even by prehistoric standards, yet intimate enough to threaten the comfort of later categories. A face half familiar, a posture possibly changing, a geography wider than expected, a fossil record still unwilling to behave, and perhaps that is why Tomai continues to linger in the imagination, not because it closes the question of beginnings, but because it refuses to. The skull from Chad does not behave like a monument. It behaves like a door found in the desert, weathered and slightly ajar, opening not into certainty but into older corridors of doubt. Behind it waits another figure, another fragment, another argument about bone and motion, and the first uncertain steps away from an older primate world. And as the night deepens around this ancient threshold, one thought remains suspended in the dust. If one distorted skull has already been enough to redraw the edge of the human beginning, what might happen when the earth gives up the next witness from the dark? A thigh bone is a modest thing to place at the centre of a mystery. It lacks the drama of a skull, the intimacy of teeth, the almost ghostly directness of a footprint pressed into ancient ash. And yet sometimes history hides its turning points in the plainer structures. Not in the face, where later generations search for likeness, but lower, in the mechanics of balance, in the architecture of movement, in the quiet question of how a body carried its own weight through the world. That is where Orrorin tugenensis enters this long and uncertain story, not as a grand answer, but as a disturbance shaped like bone. Smithsonian describes Orrorin as a species from about 6 million years ago in Kenya, whose fossil evidence suggests it was possibly capable of bipedalism, though not necessarily habitually so. That hesitation matters. It keeps the fossil alive as a question instead of embalming it as doctrine. The remains were found in the Tugen Hills of Kenya and described in 2001, a fact that mattered not only because of their age, but because they arrived at a sensitive moment in the story of human origins. The field was already learning that the earliest members of the human lineage would not present themselves politely. They were not going to line up in a clean sequence and allow modern minds the comfort of a simple ascent. Sahelanthropus had already unsettled the threshold. Now Orrorin deepened the unease. Here was another ancient being, close to the poorly lit interval after the human-chimpanzee split, carrying clues that pointed not toward enlarged brains or tool use, but toward locomotion. The first departures from an older ape-like existence may not have announced themselves in the head at all. They may have begun in the hips, the knees, the femur, in the body's slow negotiation with gravity. There is something quietly radical in that possibility. The human story is often told as if intelligence were the main axis of destiny, as though later language, symbolism and invention were already glowing in miniature inside the earliest ancestors. But fossils like Orrorin pull attention downward, away from the myth of immediate mental exceptionalism and toward the older, humbler truth that a lineage is first shaped by the way it moves. To stand differently is to see differently, to reach differently, to distribute energy differently, to inhabit distance and terrain in a new way. A change in walking is never only about walking. It alters the rhythm of life itself. The fragments attributed to Orrorin tugenensis are not abundant. That too is part of the tension. The species is known from a limited collection of fossils, including pieces of the femur, fragments of the lower jaw, teeth and parts of the upper limb and finger bones. As so often happens in this deeper archive, the evidence is enough to provoke argument but not enough to silence it. Britannica notes that Orrorin is primitive in most of its anatomy, except for femurs that appear to share traits of bipedalism with modern humans. That small phrasing, primitive in most respects but not in all, captures the strange atmosphere of these earliest hominins. They do not belong comfortably to the categories that later observers prefer. They look old, but not wholly old. They look transitional, but not obediently so. The femur became the centre of the debate for good reason. In humans, the upper part of the thigh bone bears the marks of a body that regularly balances its mass on one leg at a time while walking. Subtle anatomical patterns in the neck of the femur, the distribution of cortical bone, and the relationship of the joint to the shaft all speak to how weight moves through the skeleton. Early research argued that the Orrorin femur suggested a kind of upright locomotion. Later analyses complicated the matter rather than erasing it. A 2008 Science study and a 2013 Nature Communications paper both reinforced the importance of the femur while showing it as a mosaic, combining affinities with later hominins and older ape-like traits. That word, mosaic, returns again and again in this field because the past rarely gives us purity. It gives mixed bodies, layered signals, and creatures that seem to belong to more than one world at once. This is where the story becomes more unsettling than triumphant. If Orrorin was indeed using bipedalism in some meaningful way around 6 million years ago, then one of the defining human adaptations emerged very early, perhaps close to the root of the hominin clade. But Smithsonian's caution remains crucial. The fossil evidence suggests Orrorin was possibly capable of walking on two legs, not that it routinely did so in the way later hominins would. Capability is not the same as commitment. A creature may carry the beginning of one future while still living partly inside an older mode of life. The finger bones and upper limb hints point toward continued climbing. The body of Orrorin may have belonged neither fully to the ground nor fully to the trees. it may have inhabited the threshold itself. That threshold matters more than it first appears. Popular memory often imagines evolution as replacement by perfection. One form gives way to a better one, cleaner and more advanced. But Aurorin suggests something subtler and more haunting. Early hominin evolution may have involved prolonged coexistence of old abilities and new ones, not an abrupt exchange. Climbing did not vanish the moment upright posture appeared. Arboreal competence and terrestrial experimentation may have lived together in the same body for a very long time. The human condition, in that sense, may have begun not with certainty, but with divided loyalties, hands still remembering branches while legs began rehearsing another fate. Even the name carries a kind of poetic weight. Aurorin has been glossed as original man or original human in local language contexts, a naming choice that almost dares the fossil record to become more symbolic than it should. But the most honest way to approach Aurorin is not as the first true human in any simplistic sense. It is more enigmatic than that. It may lie close to the ancestry of later hominins. Some researchers once argued that it might even be more directly related to Homo sapiens than Lucy's species was. Though such claims remain disputed and phylogeny is still uncertain, Smithsonian frames the broader issue carefully. Whether Aurorin is a direct ancestor to modern humans remains unknown. In that unknown, the fossil keeps its power. It refuses to become a mascot for certainty. There is also something philosophically disquieting about how much depends on such small anatomical clues. Civilizations later built monumental narratives about humanity's uniqueness, but here, near the beginning, everything narrows to the thickness of bone, the shape of a neck, the angle at which force travels through a hip joint. The rise of a lineage may have depended not on revelation, but on posture, not on a sudden awakening, but on repetition, a step taken slightly differently, then again and again, until natural selection began to favour a body that could do more with that pattern under changing ecological conditions. The sublime, at the root of human history, may have been mechanical, and still the record withholds enough to remain dangerous to confidence. The fossils are incomplete. Their interpretation depends on comparison. Comparative frameworks themselves change as new material appears. One paper strengthens the case for bipedality, another emphasizes caution or mosaic anatomy. This is not failure. It is what truth looks like when the witnesses are 6 million years dead and the only testimony left is mineralized structure. The listener is asked to sit with ambiguity, not escape it. Aurorin may have walked upright with more confidence than some older apes, or it may have done so only part of the time while still moving through trees with practiced familiarity. Either possibility matters, because both reveal a lineage in transition rather than a species already complete. So the story continues in this quieter register, where revolutions happen in joints before they happen in minds. The thigh bone from Kenya does not proclaim the arrival of humanity. It does something more unsettling. It suggests that one of the great reorientations in the history of life may have begun as a compromise between worlds, an ancient body learning to divide itself between branch and ground, between old security and new exposure. And if that is true, then the next question rises almost of its own accord, patient and unresolved. When the lineage edged further into that uncertain balance, what kind of creature emerged when the trees no longer held quite enough of the future? By the time the trail reaches Ardipithecus, the story has already learned how to distrust clean transitions. The older world has not vanished, but it no longer holds unquestioned authority over the body moving through it. Trees are still present, branches are still remembered, yet something has shifted in the grammar of survival, and the shift is difficult to describe without sounding too certain. That is precisely why Ardipithecus ramidus remains so powerful. It did not simply add another name to the fossil record. It altered the atmosphere around the beginning itself. Found in Ethiopia and dated to about 4.4 million years ago, R. ramidus, especially the partial skeleton known as Ardi, forced researchers to reconsider older assumptions that early hominins first became bipedal mainly in open savanna conditions. The evidence instead pointed toward a woodland setting and a body that combined climbing with a more primitive form of terrestrial bipedality. That revision mattered more than it first appeared. For a long time, public imagination had been trained to picture the first upright ancestors stepping out of forests into spreading grassland, as if openness itself had summoned humanity into being. The image was simple, cinematic, and therefore dangerous in its neatness. But Aramis, in Ethiopia's Afar region, did not fit that old script so obediently. The reconstruction of the paleo environment around Aramis pointed to woodland and patchier forested habitats, rather than a purely open savanna. In other words, the body moving toward later hominin forms may have done so without fully abandoning trees, shade, or a more enclosed ecological world. The beginning was not where the public had been taught to look for it. Ardi herself became the quiet centre of this disruption. Smithsonian identifies ARA-VP-6/500 as a 4.4 million-year-old female partial skeleton and one of the most complete early human skeletons ever found. That completeness, relative though it is, made her unusually dangerous to inherited simplifications. A single tooth can be dismissed as an oddity. A skull fragment can be argued into competing narratives. But a partial skeleton with elements of the skull, hands, feet, limbs and pelvis asks more of the observer. It forces the body to be read as a whole, and the whole did not behave in the way earlier stories expected. Ardi did not look like a chimpanzee precursor waiting to be upgraded into a hominin. She looked like a different kind of creature altogether, one that no longer exists. This is where the unease deepens. The discoverers argued that Ardi sheds light on a common ancestor of humans and African apes that was not simply chimpanzee-like. That claim did not mean Ardi was the common ancestor itself. It meant something more unsettling. That the living apes modern humans often use as stand-ins for the past may themselves be too specialized, too fully shaped by their own millions of years of evolution, to serve as simple models for what the ancestral condition looked like. In other words, the origin of the human line may have been obscured not only by missing fossils, but by the human habit of treating living chimpanzees as preserved windows into the beginning. Ardi disturbed that habit. She suggested that both sides of the later split changed more than older narratives like to admit. Her anatomy was not tidy. That is part of why she still feels so alive in the imagination. The skeleton combined evidence of arboreal clambering and careful climbing with evidence for a primitive form of bipedality on the ground. The foot retained an opposable big toe useful for grasping, which would have made efficient human-like striding impossible in the later sense. At the same time, the pelvis and other aspects of the lower body suggested that Ardi could move upright terrestrially in a way that mattered. She was not modern. She was not a chimpanzee. She was not a rehearsal for Lucy so much as a body inhabiting a different logic of movement, partly in the trees, partly on the ground, and not fully surrendered to either world. That kind of body does something profound to the story of human evolution. It breaks the false drama of abrupt replacement. Earlier abilities did not disappear the instant new ones appeared. The lineage did not cast off climbing like an old skin the moment upright posture became useful. Instead, the evidence suggests prolonged overlap, retention, experimentation, compromise. A creature could still grasp branches and yet carry itself upright on land. It could still belong partly to the canopy, and yet begin negotiating the ground in a different way. The future did not arrive as a clean break. It entered by layering itself over older capacities. Human origins, seen through Ardi, become less like a march and more like a body learning to live with contradiction. There were other signals as well, quieter but still significant. Onoramidus had relatively reduced canine teeth compared with many apes, and the broader anatomical interpretation suggested a social and ecological pattern that did not fit neatly into expectations derived from living African apes. Researchers also inferred a predominantly C3 plant-based diet, consistent with woodland or forested habitats, rather than a heavily grassland-based ecology. These details may seem technical when stated too plainly, but in the deeper rhythm of the story they matter because they imply a way of life already diverging from familiar ape models, while not yet resembling later Australopiths. The body was being rewritten, but not along a simple line anyone would have predicted in advance, and here perhaps the philosophical wound opens again. Modern people like beginnings that can be staged dramatically. The first step onto open ground, the first freed hand, the first triumphant ancestor gazing over savannah toward destiny. Adi denies that theatrical comfort. She places the listener in a patchier, quieter world. Woodland, edge habitat, mixed movement, uncertain posture. A body that carries both memory and departure at once. The shift toward later hominin life did not begin in a world emptied of trees. It happened while branches still mattered. That alone changes the emotional texture of the beginning. Humanity did not simply leave the forest behind. It began by learning not to belong to it in the same old way. Even Adi's importance, however, does not grant perfect clarity. Britannica notes Ardipithecus ramidus broadly, from about 5.8 to 4.4 million years ago, and scientific debates remain about exactly how this species relates to later Australopiths, and how best to interpret aspects of its locomotion and ecology. But uncertainty here is not a defect. It is the native climate of this subject. Smithsonian places Ardipithecus securely among early human species, while the broader question of direct ancestry remains part of a more cautious and shifting conversation. That is exactly as it should be. The oldest chapters of the human line should feel provisional, because they are reconstructed from fossils, sediments and arguments, rather than observed in living time, and so the journey moves onward, but not upward in any simple sense. Adi stands in the corridor between the older ape world and the later Australopiths, carrying a body that remembers how to climb while beginning to write a different covenant with the ground. She does not close the question of origins. She makes it stranger. If one of the most important early ancestors lived not in the stark openness once imagined, but in woodland shadow, balancing ancient grasp and emerging bipedality, then the beginning was more layered than doctrine preferred. The first steps toward Lucy were not taken in a world of certainty, but in a half-lit landscape where old anatomies lingered and new ones gathered slowly beneath the skin. And if the body could change so deeply while still holding on to the trees, then another question waits just ahead in the dimness. When those early walkers moved further into time, what happened when the next form appeared, not instead of Adi's world, but partly from within it? The closer this journey moves toward Lucy, the less obedient the story becomes. One might expect the path to narrow as the fossils grow younger, as though time itself were preparing a cleaner corridor toward the small upright figure waiting in Ethiopia's ancient sediments. But the opposite happens. The nearer the narrative draws to what later generations recognize, the more the old fog returns. Australopithecus anamensis, generally dated to about 4.2 to 3.9 million years ago, has long been treated as the earliest widely accepted species of the genus Australopithecus and a probable ancestor of Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis. Yet discoveries announced in 2019 complicated that comforting picture by showing that A. anamensis and A. afarensis likely overlapped in time for at least 100,000 years. What had seemed like a tidy handoff from one species to the next began to look more like coexistence in mist. That complication matters because it disrupts one of the quiet habits of the modern mind, the desire to imagine human evolution as a procession. The imagination likes to seat one ancestor neatly behind another, each form rising, fading, and being replaced in an orderly file. It is almost ceremonial, this fantasy of succession. One species bows out, another enters, the curtain lifts, and history moves forward. But the fossil record, when it is allowed to speak in its own fractured grammar, rarely offers such grace. It offers overlap, regional variation, incomplete sampling, and creatures that refuse to behave like a staircase. In that refusal, A. anamensis becomes more than an ancestor. It becomes a warning against oversimplified beginnings. The species first came into scientific view through fossils from Kenya, especially Kanapoi and Alia Bay near Lake Turkana, and later through material from Ethiopia. Britannica describes A. anamensis as dating to roughly 4.2 to 3.9 million years ago, with fossils including jaws, teeth, cranial fragments, and a shin bone showing evidence consistent with bipedal walking. These remains place the species at a moment when the lineage was already leaning more decisively toward life on two legs, yet still carried the deeper memory of a more ancient primate world. That is part of what makes A. anamensis feel so important. It does not stand at the beginning of the story, but it marks a stage where the body seems to have committed more openly to an emerging pattern, even as the full meaning of that commitment remained far from clear. The shin bone has always held a certain quiet authority in this discussion. A tibia is not an emotional fossil. It does not tempt the viewer with a face, nor does it provide the symbolic power of a cranium. But it belongs to the leg, and the leg keeps telling the old secret of this lineage, that one of the most consequential transformations in human history began below the waist. The anatomy of A. anamensis suggests a creature better adapted to habitual bipedalism than earlier forms such as Ardipithecus ramidus, even though signs of retained climbing ability still shadow the broader Australopith pattern. The body was becoming more legible as a walker, but not yet in the fully familiar sense later observers like to project backward. It still belonged to a world where old capacities were not erased simply because new ones had become useful. For many years, researchers commonly treated A. anamensis as the direct ancestor of A. afarensis in a gradual lineage, a process often called anagenesis. In that older picture, one species slowly transformed into the next without branching, overlap, or sharp separation. There was a certain elegance to it, and elegance has always been tempting in origin stories. But elegance is not the same thing as truth. The nearly complete 3.8 million year old cranium from Woranso Mill in Ethiopia, often referred to as MRD, changed the atmosphere of the discussion. Smithsonian's Human Origins program states that this cranium indicates A. Anamensis overlapped in time with A. afarensis for at least 100,000 years, directly challenging the idea of a simple, seamless transformation. That overlap does not necessarily mean that A. anamensis was not ancestral to A. afarensis. Evolution is rarely polite enough to obey strict linguistic boundaries. A species can persist while a daughter lineage emerges from within it. But the new evidence does mean the older, cleaner story cannot be accepted so casually. The 2019 cranium showed that A. anamensis survived later than previously thought, and its anatomy also helped sharpen the differences between the two species. Researchers involved in the discovery argued that this pattern was more consistent with a branching event than with simple phyletic transformation. In other words, Lucy's lineage may not have replaced its predecessor in a smooth metamorphosis. It may have emerged while the older form was still alive somewhere on the landscape, breathing under the same African sky. There is something deeply unsettling in that image. Two closely related hominin species, near one another in time, perhaps sharing some broad ecological world, perhaps not meeting directly and perhaps doing so, the evidence cannot say. But coexistence changes the emotional logic of the story. It suggests that ancestry is not always a torch passed neatly from one hand to another. Sometimes it is more like a dim valley at dawn, where two silhouettes move in overlapping fog, and later observers, standing millions of years away, try to decide which one gave rise to the other. The ancient landscape offers no explanation. It only keeps the traces. The MRD skull mattered for another reason as well. Before it was found, much of what was known about A. anamensis came mainly from jaws and teeth. A better preserved cranium gave researchers a fuller view of the species' facial anatomy, and deepened the sense that this was not merely a vague precursor, but a distinctive creature in its own right. The face of Lucy's probable ancestor began to emerge with more clarity, but paradoxically, that clarity produced more ambiguity in the broader lineage. The more complete the witness became, the less tidy the family tree seemed. This is one of the recurring ironies of paleoanthropology. New fossils do not always solve the mystery. Often they reveal that the earlier solution was too simple, and perhaps that is exactly the lesson this stage of the journey is meant to teach. As the line approaches Lucy, the temptation to narrate destiny grows stronger. After all, A. afarensis is familiar in a way earlier species are not. Lucy waits there like a lantern in public memory, one of the first fossil ancestors many people learn by name. But the Earth seems unwilling to let that fame become a straight road. It places A. anamensis just behind her, and then refuses to keep the two politely separate. It widens the beginning again. It reminds the listener that the human story did not rise out of a single queue of orderly replacements. It emerged through populations, branches, overlaps and absences. The nearer one comes to a celebrated ancestor, the more one is forced to confront how provisional the whole reconstruction remains. There is also a quieter philosophical wound hidden beneath the taxonomic debate. If even this comparatively well-known portion of the lineage refuses clean succession, what does that say about humanity's hunger for linear identity? Civilizations love inheritance when it can be drawn as a straight line. They prefer founders, ancestors, and authorized beginnings. But the deeper history of the body may not honor that preference. It may instead suggest that what later became human emerged from a braided ancestry, one in which related forms existed together, diverged, and disappeared without leaving behind the kind of order later minds crave. In that sense, A. anamensis is not merely close to Lucy. It stands close to the collapse of a comforting illusion, so the path continues, but more carefully now. The Earth has brought the story to the edge of Lucy's world, yet it has done so by thickening the fog rather than clearing it. The oldest known Australopithecus no longer waits quietly in the past as a simple stepping stone. It lingers beside Lucy's species in overlapping time, like a nearly forgotten relative glimpsed at the edge of a family photograph, altering the whole meaning of the scene. And as this half-lit lineage moves onward toward the footprints and bones that will feel more hauntingly familiar, one question hangs in the silence between species. If ancestors could coexist within the same long dawn, then when the ground itself finally preserved their movement, what kind of truth would a set of ancient footsteps reveal that bones alone could not? There are moments in the history of human origins when bone is no longer enough. A skull can suggest relationship, a femur can hint at posture, teeth can imply diet, age, or evolutionary closeness. But none of these things truly move. They wait in the earth like arrested thoughts asking to be interpreted. A footprint is different. A footprint is not simply anatomy. It is behavior made visible. It is a body in motion, caught not in death, but in the act of crossing a surface that briefly remembered it. That is why the Letoli footprints in Tanzania feel so unsettling even now. They do not merely tell later observers what an ancient hominin looked like. They suggest how it passed through the world. Preserved in volcanic ash and dated to about 3.66 million years ago, the Letoli trails are widely understood as evidence of habitual bipedal locomotion, and many researchers associate them with Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species. That alone gives the site an almost spectral force. Bones can be rearranged by water, scavengers, and pressure. They can travel. They can become detached from the exact moment of life that once animated them. Footprints do something rarer. They anchor a living instant to a place. They preserve sequence. They preserve direction. They preserve weight, stride, balance, hesitation, or confidence. For a brief span of time, the earth at Letoli became a page soft enough to receive motion, and then hard enough to keep it. Millions of years later, the dead still seem to be walking there. The story begins, as so many deep stories do, with accident and attention. In 1978, Mary Leakey and her team uncovered the main Litoli footprint trails at Site G in northern Tanzania within a layer of volcanic ash that had later hardened and been buried. According to Smithsonian's Human Origins program, the prints record at least 2, and possibly 3, early hominins walking upright across wet ash after a volcanic eruption. The ash had been laid down, moistened, stepped upon, and then sealed by subsequent deposits, preserving not just shape but a rhythm of passage. That sequence matters. It means the ground did not merely trap anatomy, it trapped an event. And what an event it was. Though perhaps event is too dramatic a word for what may have been an ordinary crossing in an ordinary day of a vanished world. That is part of the eerie tenderness of Litoli. No monument was intended. No ritual was staged for posterity. No one there knew that future beings, themselves descendants of a long and uncertain lineage, would one day measure these prints with calipers and argue over gait in scientific journals. The walkers were simply moving through their landscape. Yet the ordinariness of that moment has made it one of the most extraordinary survivals in the human story. The ancient world rarely lets itself be witnessed so intimately. The footprints have long been compared with the mechanics of modern human walking, and that comparison is what gave them such importance. The trackways show heel strike followed by transfer of weight toward the front of the foot, a pattern consistent with upright bipedal locomotion. Britannica notes that the prints strongly suggest a human-like style of walking, even though the beings who made them were far from modern humans in other respects. This is one of the central revelations of Litoli. Efficient upright walking emerged long before the large brains, symbolic lives, and technological worlds later associated with humanity. The body learned this older lesson first. That reordering of expectation should not be underestimated. Modern culture often imagines intelligence as the engine of becoming human, as though cognition led and the body followed. But the footprints reverse the emotional emphasis. Before philosophy, before myth, before cities, before writing, there were steps. The line that would one day produce poets, emperors, monks, and astronomers had already begun its long covenant with upright movement. At Litoli, the evidence of that covenant is so immediate that it almost feels indecent to look at for too long. One is not merely studying a fossil trait, one is intruding upon a walk. And yet, like everything else in this deeper archive, Litoli refuses perfect simplicity. While the footprints are widely attributed to Australopithecus afarensis, because that species is known from East Africa at roughly the same time, the identification cannot be made with the total certainty reserved for modern eyewitness records. The association is strong, but inference still plays its part. The site speaks clearly about bipedal movement, less clearly about the full identities of the walkers. This matters because it preserves the integrity of the mystery. The earth reveals motion, but not everything. It grants proximity without total possession. Researchers have also continued debating the finer social and anatomical implications of the trails. How many individuals were present? Were they moving together? What can be inferred from stride length, body size, or spacing? A 2016 Nature report on newly described footprints from Litoli added fresh complexity by suggesting the presence of another, possibly larger individual, and underscoring that variation existed among these early walkers. Such work does not weaken the significance of the site, it strengthens it, because it reminds the listener that ancient hominin life was not singular and symbolic, but populated, physical, and social. These were not abstract ancestors. They were groups crossing terrain under weather and ash. There is something almost unbearable in the idea that the oldest direct traces of near-human movement survive not in a cave shrine or burial chamber, but in ash. Ash is a residue of eruption, a sign of violence from the earth. It usually speaks of destruction, interruption, and burial. Yet here destruction became preservation. A volcanic landscape wet enough to receive steps and calm enough afterward to keep them, turned catastrophe into archive. This is one of the secret patterns of the fossil record. The same planet that erases also occasionally records. The same forces that bury life sometimes protect its last gestures. Human origins survive in part because geology is contradictory, and that contradiction reaches beyond science into something more reflective. A footprint is both presence and absence at once. It is proof that someone was there and proof that they are gone. It is an outline made by contact with the world, but emptied of the body that made it. Perhaps that is why footprints have always carried symbolic force in human imagination. They feel more personal than bones, more immediate than tools, because they preserve decision. A step is a choice, however instinctive. A trackway is a sequence of choices. At Laetoli, the ancient walkers did not merely exist, they proceeded. Some scholars and science writers have emphasized how human-like the gait appears, while others have pointed to anatomical differences in afferensis that caution against imagining a fully modern stride. This tension is useful rather than frustrating. It prevents sentimentality. The Laetoli walkers were not simply modern humans in primitive disguise. They belonged to an older body plan, one that may have walked effectively upright, yet still differed in important ways from later Homo. The temptation to make them too familiar must be resisted. Their power lies partly in their nearness, partly in their strangeness. Still, even caution cannot erase the intimacy of the site. The trackways create a peculiar collapse of distance. Millions of years vanish for a moment, and the observer stands almost beside them, imagining weight sinking into ash, toes lifting free, another step following. One begins to sense that the history of the human body is not only a matter of classification but of tempo. Evolution is often described in charts and branching diagrams, but at Laetoli it becomes rhythm, left, right, forward. No speech, no written sign, no monument, only locomotion, steady enough to endure. This is why Laetoli changes the emotional centre of the journey toward Lucy. The story no longer moves only through reconstructed skeletons and contested phylogenies. It enters the domain of lived motion. The lineage has crossed from anatomical possibility into visible action. Whether the walkers were definitely afferensis, or very close kin, the message of the ash remains. By 3.66 million years ago, something remarkably near the Lucy world was already moving upright across East Africa, with a commitment that the ground itself could remember. And once the earth has shown movement, bones begin to feel different. They no longer belong only to species, they belong to travellers. So as the ancient prints fade back into silence and the path bends toward the skeleton that will one day bear Lucy's name, one question lingers like footprints disappearing under dust. When the bones of one of these walkers are finally lifted from the earth, will they confirm what the ashes whispered, or reveal that even a trail of steps can hide more than it shows? By the time the name Australopithecus afarensis begins to settle into the story, the listener may feel a dangerous temptation rising. At last, here is something familiar. Here is the species most closely associated with Lucy, one of the most famous ancestral figures ever lifted from African ground. Here, perhaps the fog will thin. Here the long corridor from ancient apes to early humans may finally begin to resemble a recognizable passage. But familiarity is one of the oldest tricks in the history of origins. It encourages the mind to relax too soon. Afarensis, which lived roughly between 3.9 and 2. 9 million years ago in East Africa is indeed one of the best-known early hominin species. Yet the better it is known, the stranger it becomes. Smithsonian describes it as showing clear evidence of bipedalism while also retaining ape-like features in the arms, fingers and upper body, an anatomy that seems to belong to more than one world at once. That mixed anatomy is precisely what gives the species its quiet force. It is easy to speak of human evolution as a progression toward efficiency, intelligence, and upright grace. Such language flatters the present. But Afarensis resists flattery. This was not a modern human waiting in a primitive costume. Nor was it merely an ape with ambitions. It was a real and distinct way of being, one now vanished, with a body that could walk upright habitually and yet still carried features linked to climbing and arboreal life. The body had advanced into one future, without surrendering every memory of another. In that sense, Afarensis is not comforting at all. It reveals that becoming human did not mean abandoning contradiction. It meant embodying it. This species is known from a remarkable range of fossil material from Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Kenya. That geographic spread matters. It means Lucy's kind was not an isolated curiosity preserved by luck in one corner of East Africa, but a broader presence across landscapes that varied in ecology and pressure. The famous localities, Hadar in Ethiopia, Letoli in Tanzania, and other sites, suggest a lineage capable of enduring within changing environments over a long span of time. Britannica notes the species-wide temporal and geographic distribution, and emphasises its combination of small brain size with strong evidence for upright walking. The old human instinct to tie significance to cranial expansion must wait. The body got there first. That reversal of emphasis remains one of the most important lessons in this deeper archive. Modern culture, especially in the age of machines and information, tends to worship the head. Intelligence is treated as the ultimate seal of destiny. But Afarensis lived millions of years before the enlarged brains associated with later members of the genus Homo. Its cranial capacity remained small, not dramatically different from that of a chimpanzee in absolute terms, and yet it walked upright across East African ground, with enough consistency for that trait to become one of the defining signatures of the species. This is unsettling because it reminds the listener that humanity's deeper roots are not primarily a story of thinking more, at least not at first. They're a story of standing differently, balancing differently, moving differently beneath gravity and sky. The skeleton tells this story in fragments, but fragments that converge. The pelvis, femur, knee, and foot all point toward habitual bipedality. Smithsonian states clearly that Afarensis walked upright and that the Letoli footprints are widely attributed to this species or a very close relative. Yet the upper body complicates the picture. Curved fingers, aspects of the shoulder, and other retained features suggest that climbing remained part of the species' capabilities and perhaps its way of life. This does not mean Afarensis was indecisive, suspended awkwardly between worlds. It means the species belonged to a different solution than modern humans do, a solution in which terrestrial bipedalism had become central without erasing an older bodily relationship to trees. There is a philosophical discomfort in that kind of body. Civilizations love purity. They prefer clean categories, ape or human, tree or ground, primitive or advanced. But Afarensis will not remain inside those boxes. It is too upright to be dismissed as merely ape-like, too anatomically archaic to be mistaken for early human in the later sense. The result is an entity that unsettles identity itself. It asks whether the human story may have been built not through the replacement of one pure form by another, but through long periods of coexistence between incompatible seeming traits. The future entered the body slowly. It did not request permission from the past. It layered itself over older architectures and let the contradictions remain visible. The hands deepen this tension. Hands matter in human mythology because they seem to foreshadow tools, art, and all the later manipulations of matter and meaning. But in Afarensis, the hands do not yet announce that later destiny so neatly. They are capable, certainly, but they still belong to a creature whose world was not one of shaped stone industries in the later, richer sense. They remind the listener that anatomy is not prophecy. A body may contain possibilities that remain unrealized for millions of years. evolution does not distribute its gifts according to the emotional timetable of future observers. It alters structures under local conditions, and only much later do some of those structures become entangled with behaviours no early Australopith could have imagined. The teeth and jaws speak in their own quiet register. The canines are reduced relative to apes, and the dentition overall fits within the Australopith pattern rather than that of later humans. Diet, inferred from teeth and isotopic evidence, points to flexibility. Use of a range of foods drawn from varied African environments, rather than a single, narrow ecological niche. That adaptability may be one reason the species endured as long as it did, but even here, caution is needed. The temptation is always to retrofit resilience into destiny, to say that A. afarensis succeeded because it was on the road to humanity. That is not what the fossil record proves. It proves only that this species survived for a substantial span, spread across regions, and left behind enough remains to make itself difficult to ignore. Survival is not a prophecy. Sometimes it is only survival, and perhaps that is what makes the species so haunting. Afarensis feels close enough to invite identification and distant enough to resist it. One can imagine the silhouette more easily than one can with Ardipithecus or Orrorin. The body is more legible, the walking more secure, the evidence more abundant. But precisely because it is more legible, the listener begins to feel the emotional weight of what has vanished. These were not abstract stepping stones. They were living beings with social bonds, injuries, births, fear, hunger, wakefulness, and the fragile routines of group life. They navigated landscapes where predators still watched, where food had to be found, where infants had to be carried or guarded, where climatic shifts could alter everything slowly enough to seem like fate. Their world is gone, but not entirely silent. Some debates continue, of course. Researchers still discuss the extent of arboreal behaviour, the precise locomotor mechanics of the species, variation across populations, and whether all fossils assigned to A. afarensis reflect a single, coherent species in the way popular accounts assume. That ongoing debate is not a weakness. It is a warning not to mistake fame for finality. Lucy's species is well known, but not exhausted. The more fossils it yields, the more finely the questions sharpen, and now the path narrows in a different way. The species has been named, its broad shape described, its contradictions allowed to remain. Yet one figure within it still waits below the surface of the story, a smaller body from Hadar, incomplete and unforgettable, who had come to stand for far more than any one skeleton should bear. Before she appears, it is worth lingering one moment longer with the species around her. Australopithecus afarensis was not a prelude written solely to deliver Lucy into scientific fame. It was a real population extended across time and terrain, a lineage that carried upright movement deeper into the African world while still holding traces of an older Promethean inheritance in its bones. Lucy will soon emerge from within that wider field, but she should not be mistaken for the whole of it. She is one body, one partial witness, one preserved interruption in a much broader life that the Earth only partly remembers. And as the story edges toward the ravine where her bones once waited in silence, one question begins to gather under the dust. When a single skeleton becomes the face of an entire forgotten species, what truths does it illuminate, and what shadows does its fame make easier to overlook? There are discoveries that enter science quietly, and there are discoveries that seem to gather myth around themselves the moment they break the surface of the Earth. Lucy belongs to the second kind. Yet the deeper one looks at her story, the less it resembles a legend of sudden revelation, and the more it resembles something fragile, contingent, almost unbearably dependent on chance. A few fragments on a slope, a decision to walk one more stretch of ground, a fossil glimpse in the dust. Smithsonian identifies Lucy as AL288-1, a 3.2 million-year-old partial skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis, found at Hadar, Ethiopia, on November 24, 1974. Britannica likewise notes that she was discovered at Hadar by Donald Johanson, and that the skeleton is roughly 40% complete. It is tempting to tell the story of Lucy as if the Earth had been waiting to hand over a perfect witness, but the past is rarely so generous. The Hadar region in Ethiopia had already become important paleoanthropological work in the early 1970s, and Johansson's team was not wandering in innocence through an untouched mystery. They were surveying a landscape already known to hold clues to the deeper human past. Britannica notes that major paleontological work at Hadar began in the early 1970s under Johansson's leadership, and Smithsonian places Lucy within a broader East African record of Aepharensis fossils rather than as an isolated miracle. In that sense, Lucy did not descend from nowhere. She emerged from a field of patient searching, repeated uncertainty, and landscapes that had begun to reveal piece by piece the outline of an older world. Still, even methodical science lives at the mercy of accident. Accounts of the discovery describe Johansson and graduate student Tom Gray walking near locality 162 at Hadar when a fragment of bone caught the eye. Smithsonian records that Lucy was found at Hadar and later nicknamed during the team celebration that evening when the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing. Britannica adds the now familiar date of November 24, 1974, and emphasises the extraordinary completeness of the specimen by the standards of such ancient finds. The modern listener, knowing what Lucy would become, may feel an almost superstitious awe at that scene. But awe should not erase the underlying fact. If a few centimetres of fossil had remained hidden in sediment, the symbolic centre of early human evolution might have worn another name. This is one of the quieter lessons Lucy teaches before any anatomical analysis begins. A discovery is not the same thing as the existence of truth. Lucy existed whether or not any modern human ever found her. But once found, she began to reshape the narrative of origins because she was unusually informative. Smithsonian states that AL288-1 preserves a large enough portion of the skeleton to reveal crucial information about locomotion and body form. Britannica's description of Lucy as roughly 40% complete helps explain why she struck the field with such force. For a fossil of that antiquity, this was not merely a trace, it was an interruption large enough to challenge assumptions. At the time of her discovery, Lucy mattered not simply because she was old, but because she arrived with a body that carried a difficult message. She had a small brain case preserving the ancient truth that large brains had not yet become the dominant signature of the lineage. Yet her pelvis, femur and other anatomical features strongly indicated upright bipedal walking. Smithsonian explicitly notes that Lucy could walk upright on 2 feet, while still retaining many ape-like features in the upper body and skull. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History similarly reflects on how Lucy's anatomy helped overturn older assumptions by showing that bipedalism clearly preceded dramatic brain enlargement. This combination, small brain, upright gait, was scientifically powerful precisely because it disrupted the old intuition that human-like intelligence must have led the way. And yet Lucy is more than an anatomical argument. She is also a lesson in reconstruction. The public often encounters her as a complete figure, a small, upright female, 3.2 million years old, standing at the threshold of humanity. But the actual fossil was never a whole body laid out intact for easy interpretation. It was an assemblage of pieces, hundreds of bone fragments associated with one individual, then studied, fitted, compared and interpreted across time. Smithsonian's AL288-1 page presents Lucy as a reconstructed skeleton, which is exactly what she is. Not a direct photograph of the past, but a painstaking human reading of broken remains. That distinction matters. Reconstruction is one of science's noblest arts, but it is still an art of inference. The fossil record never offers itself without translation. There is something almost philosophical in that dependence on fragments. Human beings spend much of their cultural life pretending that knowledge arrives in finished form. They want origins as certainties, ancestors as singular icons, evidence as if it were immune to interpretation. Lucy resists that desire even while fulfilling part of it. She's famous precisely because she seems to provide a face, or at least a body, for a forgotten stage of the human story. Yet the more closely one looks, the more one sees how much of her meaning depends on context. The sediments at Hadar, the dating of the layers, the comparative anatomy of other fossils, the ongoing debates over how much time Afarensis still spent in trees, the relationship between Lucy and the wider population of her species. Fame simplifies. Science reopens complexity. Even the nickname carries that double life of intimacy and distortion. Lucy made the fossil memorable to the public, while Dinknesh, the Amharic name meaning "you are marvellous," tied her more closely to Ethiopia, the land that preserved her. Smithsonian records both names, and the coexistence of those names feels fitting. One belongs to global scientific memory, the other to a more local and human register of wonder. But names can also do what names always do: make a specimen feel singular enough to eclipse the wider field around it. Lucy became an icon, and icons cast shadows. Behind her stand many other Afarensis individuals, other bones, other partial lives that together reveal the species as more than a single famous skeleton. The landscape of Hadar deserves its own place in this mood of reflection. Lucy was not found in a ceremonial chamber, not preserved with deliberate human intent, but in sediments laid down in a much older world. Hadar, in Ethiopia's afar region, is now inseparable from the study of human origins, because the geology there preserved a long archive of hominin life. But that archive is not arranged for comfort. It is exposed by erosion, fragmentary by nature, vulnerable to reinterpretation with each new find. A ravine can become an archive only because time first became destruction. The same erosive processes that uncover bone also remind the observer how much was lost before a single fragment reached daylight. This is why Lucy's discovery still feels haunted, even after decades of study. The skeleton is famous enough to seem almost settled, but what it represents remains larger and less stable than a museum label can contain. She is a witness to a body plan that no longer exists, a small-brained, habitually bipedal hominin still carrying older anatomical inheritances in its frame. She's also a witness to how science works when its subject lies millions of years beyond any memory. One does not question Lucy's importance. One questions the human tendency to turn importance into closure. If anything, Lucy should do the opposite. She should deepen unease. She should remind the listener that even the most celebrated fossil ancestor is not the beginning itself, only a bright interruption in a much older dark. And so the story reaches her at last, not as the end of a mystery, but as its most luminous fragment so far. The slope at Hadar gave back enough of one life to transform the study of human evolution, yet not enough to quiet the deeper questions that surround her. Lucy stands between familiarity and erasure, between icon and evidence, between the comfort of a named ancestor and the discomfort of knowing how much still lies beyond her in silence. The ravine kept her for 3.2 million years, and then released her into a species hungry for beginnings. But perhaps the most unsettling part of her legacy is this. Once a single skeleton becomes the lantern by which a civilization tries to see its own origin, how much darkness begins to gather just outside the circle of that light? Lucy is often introduced to the world as though she were a beginning that had finally learned how to stand still for a portrait. A small ancestral female, upright, ancient, almost familiar. But that image, however useful, conceals something essential. Lucy was not a rough draft of a modern woman. She was not a primitive human waiting to be finished. She belonged to a form of existence that has no living continuation, a body assembled for a world that no longer exists, carrying in its structure a mixture of commitments that later life would divide more sharply. That is why her anatomy remains so arresting. It does not tell a simple story of progress. It reveals a vanished compromise. Smithsonian's Human Origins program identifies Lucy as AL288-1, a 3.2 million-year-old Australopithecus afarensis skeleton, whose pelvis and leg bones show that she could walk upright, while other parts of her body still retained ape-like features. To understand Lucy properly, one must begin with size. She was small, standing only about 105 centimetres tall, or roughly 3 feet 5 inches. Britannica describes her as slight in stature, and Smithsonian notes that she represents an adult female of her species. This smallness matters, not as a charming detail, but as a warning against projecting modern bodily assumptions backward into deep time. The upright body of Lucy was not the upright body of a later human. It was shorter, differently proportioned, and adapted within an entirely different ecological and evolutionary context. Her scale alone reminds the listener that the history of bipedalism was not built by bodies already approaching the modern human form. It was built by creatures whose presence, if seen at dusk across an ancient Ethiopian landscape, would have seemed both near and deeply strange. The pelvis lies near the centre of this strangeness. In human origins research, the pelvis often becomes a kind of quiet battlefield, because so much depends on it. Lucy's pelvis is one of the major reasons researchers concluded that she habitually walked upright. Smithsonian notes that her pelvis, along with other skeletal features, shows adaptation to bipedalism. The shorter, broader shape differs from the long, narrow pelvis of a typical quadrupedal ape, and speaks to a body whose trunk and balance had already entered a new relationship with gravity. Upright walking was not an occasional accident in Lucy. It was part of the species' central design. Yet even here, caution is necessary. Bipedal does not mean modern human in motion. It means that a crucial threshold had been crossed, while other older anatomical patterns still remained. The femur and knee deepen that message. Lucy's lower limb anatomy supports the view that she moved regularly on 2 legs, with joints shaped to handle the shifting of body weight required in upright gait. This echoes the broader pattern seen across A. afarensis, which Smithsonian describes as a species with clear evidence for bipedal locomotion. But the power of Lucy lies in the fact that this evidence comes not from an isolated leg bone or a single footprint, but from a partial skeleton that lets different parts of the body speak to one another. The lower body tells a coherent story about terrestrial uprightness. If the human story had ended at the hips and knees, later generations might have been tempted to congratulate themselves too early. But Lucy does not end there. The upper body refuses closure. Smithsonian notes that Lucy retained many ape-like features, and research reviews on Australopithecus afarensis have long emphasized the significance of the shoulders, arms, and curved finger bones in discussions about climbing ability. Nature's citable resource summarizing that literature points toward ongoing debate over arboreality in A. afarensis, while still recognizing the species as habitually bipedal. This is where Lucy becomes most unsettling. She walked upright, yes, but she also carried in her frame signs of an older bodily dialogue with trees. Her species had not erased its arboreal inheritance. It had layered a new terrestrial future over it. In Lucy, the past was not discarded. It remained visible in the architecture of the body itself. That layered anatomy has often invited a false question. Was Lucy more ape or more human? The question feels natural, but it is built on a misunderstanding. Lucy was neither a halfway point in a moral ascent nor a confused intermediate trapped between categories. She was an Australopithecus afarensis, complete in her own way, suited to her own conditions, no less real for lacking modern traits. The need to measure her against later humanity says more about modern insecurity than about the fossil itself. Bodies in evolution do not exist to satisfy future identity crises. They exist because they worked, for a time, under specific conditions. Lucy's anatomy was not unfinished, it was adapted. The tragedy, if there is one, lies only in the fact that the world for which it was adapted has vanished. The skull reminds the observer of this distance. Lucy's brain was small, far smaller than that of modern humans, and yet her locomotor anatomy already expressed a decisive shift toward upright life. This combination has become one of the best-known lessons of paleoanthropology. Big brains came later. Smithsonian explicitly presents Lucy as evidence that bipedalism preceded encephalization in the human lineage. That fact should still feel unsettling. Modern civilization has built itself around the worship of mind, abstraction, calculation, and symbolic excess. But one of its most famous ancestors carried none of these in anything like the later human form. What Lucy carried was a body that had already reorganized itself for a different way of moving through the world. Thought did not lead the revolution. Posture did. There is also a quieter debate concealed within Lucy's bones. How much time did her species still spend in the trees? Researchers have argued for decades about the degree of arboreal behavior in A. afarensis. Smithsonian's species page acknowledges both upright walking and ape-like anatomical features, while research reviews collected by Nature's Citable reflect the persistence of this conversation. The point is not that science is uncertain about whether Lucy could walk upright. It is that the body preserves more than one kind of history at once. Lucy may have been a committed terrestrial biped and still retained meaningful climbing abilities. This is not contradiction in a careless sense, it is evolutionary layering. The body can carry traces of older worlds long after a new central mode of life has emerged. That insight makes Lucy harder to sentimentalize. Museums and textbooks often present her as approachable, almost intimate, because familiarity helps memory. But too much familiarity can become distortion. The listener should resist the urge to imagine Lucy as us, but smaller. She was not us. Her pelvis, feet, arms, skull and proportions all belong to a body plan now extinguished. Even the gait inferred from her anatomy, though upright, may not have matched modern human walking in every detail. The Laetoli footprints and the broader A. afarensis record suggest effective bipedality, but not necessarily a body already optimized in the later human fashion. Lucy stands close enough to be haunting, and far enough to remain untamed by identification, and perhaps that is why her anatomy continues to hold such emotional power. It is not only evidence, it is a mirror of evolutionary tension. In Lucy, one sees a lineage remembering the trees while increasingly trusting the ground. One sees a small-brained creature whose body had already committed to a path that would eventually reshape the planet, though nothing in her own life could have hinted at such consequences. One sees, above all, a form of being that has no exact modern equivalent. She is close enough to unsettle the boundary between human and non-human, yet distinct enough to expose how crude that boundary can be when projected backward into deep time. So Lucy's body should not be read as a simple answer to the question of who humans are. It should be read as a vanished arrangement of bone and motion, one that helped make later humanity possible without ever becoming humanity in the later sense. She was not a prototype, she was a witness. The ground kept enough of her to reveal that upright life had already taken deep hold, but it also kept enough of the older anatomy to prevent the comforting illusion of a straight ascent. In that tension lies her true significance. And as the story turns from her bones toward the life that may have surrounded them, the landscapes, the groups, the dangers, the daily rhythms that no skeleton can fully preserve, another question rises softly from the dark. If Lucy's body was already walking into the future while still carrying the memory of an older world, what did it actually feel like to live inside that threshold? A skeleton can tell the listener how a body was built, but it cannot easily tell how a day felt while that body was still warm. It cannot recreate the shifting light over a riverbank, the smell of wet earth after seasonal rain, the tension of listening for danger in tall grass, or the instinctive closeness of a small group moving through a landscape that did not yet belong to humans in the later sense. And yet, once Lucy's bones have been read for posture, proportion and locomotion, another question begins to press against the edges of the story. What kind of world held a creature like her? Not only what species she was, but what reality she inhabited. The answer must remain careful, because no written witness survives from 3.2 million years ago. But the sediments of Hadar, the broader record of Australopithecus afarensis, and the animals and plants associated with those deposits suggest a life lived in mosaic environments: riverine forest, woodland, bushland, and more open patches of grassland, rather than in a single simple setting. That word mosaic matters more than it first appears. It means Lucy's world was not one thing. It was not the pure forest of older ape memory, nor the fully open country that popular imagination once used to stage the rise of upright humanity. It was varied, broken into ecological pieces, a patchwork of opportunities and exposure. Smithsonian notes that Lucy and others of her species could use resources from woodlands, grasslands, and other diverse environments because they could walk upright on the ground and also climb trees. That combination changes the emotional texture of the world around her. Trees were not simply relics of an older past. They were still useful. The ground was not merely a transit zone between branches, it had become central. Lucy's life likely unfolded in a landscape where movement between these zones mattered every day, where survival depended not on purity of adaptation, but on versatility. A world like that would not have been quiet in the sentimental sense. It would have been full of signals. Water sources would draw animals. Seasonal shifts would alter where food could be found and how far a group might need to move. The broader East African Pliocene supported a diversity of large mammals and carnivores greater in some respects than what the same regions hold today. Smithsonian's more recent reflections on Lucy's species place A. afarensis among woodlands and forests, inhabited by saber-toothed cats and other formidable animals, while Britannica notes habitat evidence consistent with woodland and patches of grassland. The listener should resist the temptation to romanticize this world as peaceful, because it was ancient. It was beautiful, perhaps, but beauty in prehistory often stood beside danger without apology. Diet adds another layer to this vanished world. Smithsonian species account describes A. afarensis as having mainly a plant-based diet that included leaves, fruit, seeds, roots, nuts, and insects, probably supplemented by occasional small vertebrates. That kind of menu suggests not a specialist locked to one food source, but a flexible forager exploiting whatever the shifting mosaic offered. Lucy's world was therefore not simply a stage for locomotion, it was a field of constant choosing: what to eat, where to move, when to remain near cover, when to cross more open terrain. A generalized diet does not sound dramatic at first, but it may have been one of the quiet strengths of the species. In a variable environment, rigidity can become a sentence. Flexibility can become its own form of endurance, and yet endurance should not be confused with comfort. Lucy's species lived with bodies that were capable, but still vulnerable. There were no weapons in the later human sense, no firelight to hold predators fully at bay, no shelters built with long-term intention, no written memory, no inherited map beyond what group life, instinct, and repeated movement could preserve. Everything would have been immediate. Infants had to be protected without the support systems of later human communities. Food had to be gathered or found within a social rhythm that likely depended on cooperation, vigilance, and learned familiarity with terrain. Smithsonian notes that many fossils of Afarensis, including individuals of different ages, have been found, which at the very least implies populations rather than isolated beings. Lucy was not a solitary miracle wandering a symbolic landscape. She was part of a living species, and living species endure through groups, however small, temporary or vulnerable. That group life remains difficult to reconstruct in detail, and honesty demands restraint. No one can say precisely how Lucy's kind organised themselves socially on an ordinary day, but anatomy and comparative primate reasoning allow careful inferences about dependence, sexual dimorphism, and the importance of social proximity. Fossils from Hadar include multiple individuals, and Smithsonian's fossil pages note size differences between specimens such as Lucy and larger males from the same species. This suggests a species in which body size varied meaningfully between sexes, though the social implications remain debated. What matters here is not a dramatic claim about family structure, but a quieter recognition. Lucy's life almost certainly unfolded among others, warning, feeding, resting, moving, protecting young. These are rarely solitary acts in primates. The threshold toward later humanity was crossed not by isolated geniuses of evolution, but by groups carrying their uncertainty together. There is something profoundly moving in that thought. Modern people often search the deep past for the first signs of what makes them exceptional. Tools, language, symbolic intention, perhaps even the earliest shadow of self-consciousness. But the world around Lucy suggests that what mattered first may have been something more elemental, staying alive within change. Climate instability has long been discussed by Smithsonian's Human Origins program as a broader force shaping hominin evolution, and although no single climatic event explains Lucy's daily life, the larger pattern matters. The East African environments occupied by early hominins were not eternally fixed. Over long timescales, shifting rainfall, vegetation, and resource distribution would have altered the conditions under which bodies like Lucy's survived. Her species did not live in a museum diorama. It lived in flux. This may be the deepest threshold of all. Lucy's kind stood between worlds not because they possessed secret knowledge of the future, but because their bodies had already become committed to a new relation with terrain, while their lives remained fully exposed to an ancient order of risk. They were not yet human in the later sense. No cities, no myths carved into stone, no systems of written memory. Yet they were no longer simply creatures of the old ape forest. They moved through a harsher openness with an upright gait and an inherited memory of climbing. They fed broadly, adapted widely, and remained vulnerable in every direction. The listener, lying in the comfort of the present, may feel a strange ache in that realization. Lucy's world was not a beginning that knew it was beginning. It was only a present tense lived without prophecy, and perhaps that is why the life around her feels so haunting. The earth preserved her bones, but not the ordinary mournings of her species. It kept enough to show the shape of the body, enough to hint at habitat and diet, enough to remind later minds that the road to humanity passed through woodland edges, danger, flexibility, and group dependence. But it did not preserve the inner weather of that life. It did not keep the pulse of alarm, the relief of shade, the instinctive hush when something large moved nearby. That absence matters. It leaves Lucy not as a fully knowable ancestor, but as a figure standing in a half-lit world whose daily reality can only be approached through traces. And as the story prepares to turn from her lived environment toward the larger problem of missing evidence and historical certainty, one final question hangs over the Pliocene dusk. If so much of her world can only be inferred from fragments, how much of the human beginning has always depended on what the Earth chose not to keep? The deeper this story goes, the less it resembles a road, and the more it resembles a field of broken signals. That may be the hardest truth for the modern mind to accept. People are trained to believe that the past, if studied carefully enough, will eventually surrender a continuous account of itself, a timeline, a chain, a proper beginning followed by orderly development. But the history of human evolution resists that desire at almost every scale. Smithsonian's Human Origins program states plainly that the human family tree has many more branches and deeper roots than people once thought, and that the older idea of a single line of species evolving one after the other is no longer supported. Even now, the exact number of early human species remains debated. The listener, having travelled from ancient ape worlds to Lucy's shadow, is left with an unsettling realization. The closer one comes to the beginning, the more certainty begins to thin. This thinning does not mean the science is weak. It means the evidence is difficult. Britannica notes that the fossil record is incomplete. Only a small proportion of organisms are ever preserved as fossils, and only a tiny fraction of those fossils are eventually recovered and studied. That fact alone should change the emotional tone of every origin story. What survives into science is not the past in full, but a remnant selected by burial, chemistry, erosion, visibility, access, and luck. Entire populations may leave almost nothing. Whole stretches of evolutionary time may be represented by fragments so sparse that one newly discovered jaw or cranium can alter the shape of the tree. The silence surrounding early humanity is not necessarily a sign of concealment by some deliberate hand. More often, it is the silence produced by preservation itself, time keeping only what it can bear to keep. And yet, once these scattered remnants enter modern institutions, another transformation occurs. Fossils become exhibits, timelines become posters, debates become captions. A public hungry for clarity is usually offered the most stable version of a story that researchers themselves continue to refine. This is not always deception. Often it is simplification, the ordinary pressure of education and communication. But simplification has consequences. Smithsonian's overview of human fossils emphasizes that the family tree is branching and diverse, while popular memory still often clings to the older image of a straight ascent. Somewhere between the excavation trench and the textbook, uncertainty is often smoothed away. A complicated ancestry becomes a procession. A disputed relationship becomes a settled ladder. What began as caution hardens into narrative. Lucy's fame is a perfect example of this paradox. She is enormously important, and rightly so. Her skeleton helped demonstrate that upright walking preceded large brain expansion, and Smithsonian's record of Australopithecus afarensis makes her one of the key witnesses to that stage of the story. But her very fame also invites distortion. A single skeleton, no matter how informative, can begin to stand for an entire vanished species, and that species can in turn begin to stand for a whole evolutionary chapter more complex than any one specimen can contain. Lucy illuminates much, but she also casts a shadow. Behind her are other A. afarensis fossils, debates about locomotion and climbing, questions about variation, and broader uncertainties about how exactly her species fits within the branching human tree. The lantern is real, so is the darkness beyond it. That darkness grows thicker whenever a new fossil arrives and disturbs what seemed settled. Smithsonian species pages repeatedly reflect this pattern. The accepted picture changes as the evidence changes. Australopithecus anamensis was long treated as a straightforward ancestor to A. afarensis, until a more complete cranium suggested temporal overlap and complicated the old model. Earlier in the story, fossils such as Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, and Ardipithecus all carried similar disruptive force, not because they destroyed the broader case for evolution, but because they made the details stranger and less linear. This is one of the deepest lessons of paleoanthropology. New finds do not merely add dots to a finished map. Sometimes they reveal that the map itself was drawn too neatly. There is a quiet irony in the way the public often reacts to this. When a new fossil reshapes interpretation, some take that revision as evidence that the science cannot be trusted. But revision is not a sign of collapse. It is a sign that the field is alive. Smithsonian's evidence pages present human evolution as a body of knowledge built from multiple lines of evidence: fossils, genetics, archaeology, and climate research, not as a frozen doctrine immune to change. In a subject where witnesses are millions of years dead, self-correction is not a weakness. It is the nearest thing to intellectual honesty available. The trouble begins only when the public is given the impression that the story was ever meant to be final. And perhaps this is where the old suspicion of official history finds its most honest form, not as a dramatic tale of a single institution hiding the truth in locked vaults, but as a more ordinary and pervasive habit of systems, the tendency to prefer legibility over ambiguity. Museums need labels, schools need summaries, media needs hooks. The result is that a branching, uncertain and partly missing history is often presented as if it were far cleaner than the specialists themselves would claim. Britannica's overview of human evolution notes that claims for numerous fossil hominin species are assessed case by case, and that the limitations of evidence complicate efforts to trace how lineages changed over time. That is a sober statement. Yet the public version often arrives as a row of skulls, each one gazing obediently toward the next. There is another loss hidden inside this flattening. Once the story becomes too linear, the vanished alternatives disappear twice. First, they vanish biologically, leaving only sparse traces. Then they vanish narratively, excluded from simplified accounts that need a clean progression toward modern humanity. But the Earth does not support that simplicity. Smithsonian explicitly says the human family tree has more branches and deeper roots than once imagined. Branches matter. They mean there were multiple forms, overlapping experiments, different bodies and lives sharing ancient landscapes. Some were close to later humans, some were not, and many may never be known well enough to place securely. The human beginning was not a solitary ascent. It was a crowded, thinning field. That recognition changes the philosophical weight of the entire journey, from ancient apes to Lucy. If the fossil record is fragmentary, if the number of species is debated, if public narratives tend to simplify what researchers continue to question, then human origins is not a solved monument standing in bright daylight. It is a reconstruction raised over missing ground. That does not make it false. It makes it fragile. The listener who has followed the story this far should not come away thinking nothing is known. Much is known. Bipedalism emerged early. Lucy's species walked upright. The family tree branches and the oldest chapters of the lineage belong in Africa. But alongside that knowledge sits a more difficult truth. There is no complete archive waiting to be opened, only a partial record that must be read with care. Perhaps that is why the beginning continues to feel so haunted. Human beings want origins to justify who they are. They want a clean inheritance, a stable ancestry, a reassuring line from then to now. But the deeper record offers something else. It offers scattered bones, contested species, revised diagrams, and a recurring lesson in humility. It suggests that what later became human emerged not from a single polished chain, but from a landscape of partial survivals and unresolved relations. Lucy remains luminous, but she is luminous inside a ruin, not a palace. And as this long journey approaches its final reflective turn, one question lingers with particular sharpness in the dark. If the story of human beginnings has always depended on fragments, revisions, and the narrowing beam of evidence, then is the most human response to that past really certainty? Or is it the willingness to keep searching even when the ground refuses to become whole? By now the journey has passed through forests, ash, femurs, skulls, and the small upright body of Lucy, and yet the oldest question remains almost untouched at its centre. Not what species came first, or which bone proves what angle of gait, but what it means that a creature so obsessed with origins can know its own beginning only in fragments. The fossil record has shown again and again that the human family tree is not a single line, but a branching, deeply rooted pattern, far more diverse than older public narratives once allowed. The Smithsonian's Human Origins program states this plainly. Fossil discoveries have revealed many more branches and deeper roots than researchers recognized only a few decades ago, and the exact number of early human species remains debated. That is not a small correction to an otherwise settled story. It is a warning that the origin of humanity may be permanently more plural, more provisional, and more difficult than the modern imagination prefers. This is where the word origin begins to feel almost misleading. Origin sounds singular, as though there were one doorway, one authorized threshold, one first true ancestor standing at the gate between ape and human. But the evidence resists that picture. Smithsonian's family tree and species summaries present a lineage marked by overlap, branching, uncertainty, and extinct forms, accepted by most scientists only provisionally within a wider field of debate. Britannica, too, emphasizes that strong evidence supports branching from a common African ape ancestry, rather than a neat linear ascent, and that the broader history of human evolution is staged through multiple forms and transitions, rather than one clean sequence. To keep using the word origin, then, is to speak in a language the Earth itself keeps revising, and yet human culture continues to long for singularity. There is comfort in believing that a beginning can be named, localized, and converted into a stable inheritance. Civilizations have always wanted approved ancestors. They prefer a line rather than a thicket, a founder rather than a population, a moment of emergence rather than a long and uneven becoming. That desire shapes not only myth and religion, but the public digestion of science. Smithsonian's fossil overview explains that people once imagined a single line of human species evolving one after another in an inevitable march toward modern humans, but that this is no longer how the evidence is understood. Still, the old image survives in classrooms, documentaries, posters, and casual memory because it is emotionally efficient. It flatters the present. It lets humanity imagine itself as the destination of a process rather than one temporary branch, among many vanished experiments in being. That is why Lucy remains so powerful and so dangerous. Smithsonian's record identifies Lucy as a 3.2 million year old Australopithecus afarensis skeleton from Hadar, Ethiopia, and its species page notes that A. afarensis lived between about 3.85 and 2.95 million years ago in eastern Africa. These are straightforward facts, and yet around them an entire mythology of recognition has formed. Lucy is often treated as if she were not merely one partial skeleton within a species, but the face of a beginning. Her fame makes her luminous, but luminosity can be deceptive. The lantern that helps later minds see one corridor of the past can also make them forget the darkness beyond it. Lucy clarifies an evolutionary stage. She does not simplify the whole archive. The same pattern repeats across the broader story. A new fossil is found. It enters public awareness as a breakthrough. For a while it seems to settle the narrative. Then more evidence appears and the earlier certainty softens. Smithsonian species listings make this clear in structure alone. The accepted early human species are numerous. The count is debated, and their time spans overlap. What had seemed like a chain increasingly resembles a network of partly related populations, extinctions, side branches, and uncertain ancestry. This does not make the science weak. It makes the science honest. The weakness appears only when institutions of public memory, whether education, media, or the informal myth-making of culture, present an actively revised field as if it were a final inheritance. There is another quieter tension here as well. The deeper the evidence goes, the more it depends on specialized methods: stratigraphy, radiometric dating, comparative anatomy, phylogenetic inference, genetics where available, paleo-environmental reconstruction. Smithsonian's evidence pages explicitly organize human origins through multiple streams: fossils, genetics, footprints, timelines, and climate research. This plurality is a strength because no single line of evidence bears the entire burden alone. At the same time, such complexity places modern people in a strange position. Most cannot personally verify the underlying analyses. They must trust expert communities while also accepting that those communities revise their views as new data arrive. For minds raised on certainty, that can feel unstable. But instability in this context is not a defect of truth. It is what truth looks like when the archive is buried, partial, and millions of years old. Perhaps that is why fringe certainty and oversimplified certainty often mirror one another more than either side realizes. One claims the official story is too fixed. The other clings to diagrams as though revision were failure. Both can underestimate the actual condition of the record. The more sober view is less theatrical and therefore harder to love. It accepts that the human story is recoverable only in part, and that each recovery is interpretive. Britannica's overview of human evolution stresses that the lineage branched from the line that produced the great apes in Africa, sometime between 6 and 7 million years ago. But even there the dating remains range, not a witnessed instant. Smithsonian's FAQ echoes the same broad window for the common ancestor with chimpanzees. The route is known by convergence of evidence, not by a preserved scene. That difference matters. It teaches a form of intellectual restraint that modern culture rarely rewards. Restraint, however, is not the same as emptiness. Some things are clear. The oldest accepted early hominins are African. Upright terrestrial locomotion emerged deep in the lineage. Lucy's species was habitually bipedal and still retained ape-like traits. The Litoli footprints, most likely made by Australopithecus afarensis, preserve remarkably early evidence of upright walking around 3.6 million years ago. These are not fantasies. They are durable conclusions built from converging evidence. But even these clearer points do not restore the totality of what has been lost. They sketch a structure. They do not refill the vanished world. One can know that a lineage walked upright and still not know how many related forms moved beside it, how many local populations left no trace, how many ecological pressures shaped bodies whose bones dissolved before discovery. Knowledge grows. Wholeness does not return. And maybe that is the most unsettling thing the story has to offer. Humanity often imagines that understanding the past will secure identity in the present, but the deeper record suggests the opposite. The more carefully the beginning is studied, the less it supports the fantasy of a simple, authorized human essence. It reveals kinship with other apes, branching ancestry, bodily compromise, overlapping species, and a long prehistory in which the traits later celebrated as uniquely human emerged piecemeal and without ceremony. The beginning does not flatter. It humbles. It places the modern world back inside nature, back inside contingency, back inside a family tree that is neither neat nor complete. So the journey approaches its final threshold not with a triumphant summary, but with a narrowing light. The bones have spoken as clearly as they can. The ash has preserved a walk. The skulls have disrupted each other. The species have multiplied where older charts preferred simplicity. Lucy remains in the mind, small and upright, but now she stands not as the answer to human origins, only as one of its most moving witnesses. Behind her stretches a crowd of older lives. Beyond her, a future none of them could imagine. And perhaps the most honest legacy of the whole search is this quiet discomfort. If the human beginning survives only as a branching ruin pieced together from scattered signs, then maybe what defines the species is not that it knows where it came from, but that it keeps leaning into the dark, asking for wholeness from a world that has never promised to give it.